everybody was surprised by President Lee declaring martial law. And so I do think that, and in any event, I don't think presidentialism is a good system. You can solve the multi-party problem by moving. And I think that that's really the crisis we're in. It's more a crisis of the of liberal democracy.
안녕하세요. 오늘 프로페썰에서는 정치학계의 석학이자 민주주의를 논할 때 빼놓을 수 없는 분인 프랜시스 후쿠야마 교수님을 모셨습니다. Welcome to Korea. It is an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
And when did you first came to Korea, and how has Korea changed since your first visit?
I believe that I came either in the late 80s or early 90s. So this was after Korea had gone past the military dictatorship and had become a democracy. I don't know, I've probably made 15, 20 visits to Korea over the next several decades. And it's been very interesting watching the evolution of democracy and democratic institutions in this country.
And you originally studied classics in your undergraduate,
Yes.
and that is one of the rare majors. And what led you to politics in graduate school? Like, is there any interest in there?
Well, I had some very good teachers. One of my early teachers was Alan Bloom, who was a political philosopher. And he taught the first seminar I ever took when I was an undergraduate at Cornell, which was a seminar on Plato's Republic, which is a philosophical dialogue about the meaning of justice. And from that moment on, I thought that it was very important to have this basic background in the humanities so that you can study really big questions about what is the best way to live, what is the nature of the best regime, and this sort of thing.
You must have also had some interest in philosophy as well. You write a lot about philosophers' terms, such as Hegel. So did you also study philosophies during in between?
As an undergraduate, I read a lot of the basic philosophical texts in the Western tradition. And again, I think it's very important to understand, for example, what is the origin of our contemporary ideas about liberal democracy? Where do they come from? How did they evolve? How are they different now than when they first appeared, and so forth?
And you also worked with Samuel Huntington. How was your experience there, and had this influenced your work throughout your history?
So Samuel Huntington was a very great political scientist who made major contributions in quite a number of subfields in political science. The ones that were most important to me were in comparative politics and development, because prior to his great book, Political Order in Changing Societies, that was published in 1968, many people had I think, a simple-minded view of modernization, that countries would just modernize, they'd become democratic, they'd become rich, they'd become stable, and that was not happening. And he was the first political scientist to try to give an explanation for why the path to development really was very difficult for many countries.
So then let's move on to your very first book, and you're probably the most famous book by far. The original essay you wrote had a question mark in the end of history. I was wondering, why did you decide to drop the question mark in your final book version?
Well, I didn't drop the question mark. The question mark is still there in the text. So the issue is we're not certain about the future of democracy. When I wrote that book, it seemed like much of the world was turning in the direction of liberal democracy. But I also felt that there were reasons why democracy may not ultimately be stable. And that was the last 5 chapters of the book, The End of History and the Last Man. These were the chapters about the last man, about why in a stable, prosperous democracy, people may not be satisfied and therefore may seek to overturn that democracy. And I think that's some of the phenomena that we're seeing today with the rise of populism in the United States, in Europe, in other democratic societies.
So over 3 decades later, do you have any part of the book that you would like to revise, or any part that you wouldn't change?
Well, I did revise the book in a sense. I wrote a 2-volume series on the first one, The Origins of Political Order, and the second volume, Political Order and Political Decay. And I regard that as my effort to rewrite the end of history. And there was a couple of important changes. The first one was my recognition that getting to a modern state is actually much harder than getting to democracy, and it's a challenge that relatively few countries have mastered. The second is the whole concept of political decay, that you have evolution towards democracy, but you also have regression away from democracy. And I think in the United States and in many other countries over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen political decay where democratic institutions no longer work as well as they used to.
So moving on to your next book, and this is my actually favorite book of yours, Identity. You use the concept of themos or thumos in the book very often. Could you explain about the concept a little easier way to our viewers?
Well, thumos is a Greek word that can be translated into English as pride or self-respect. It's the desire to be recognized, to have your dignity recognized by other people. And I think that in politics, this is really one of the big drivers, that people want resources, they want material goods, they want an income, but they also want respect. And you give respect to people in different ways. I mean, one way is in a democracy, you grant them rights, and you protect those rights because you say you're a human being and you have a right to speech, to belief, to political participation. But it also comes in other ways in terms of the economy. If you don't have a job, if you're unemployed, or people don't respect you as if you had a great education and you were doing really important things. And I think that one of the drivers now of discontent in many democracies is the fact that many people don't feel that they're being respected.
And nowadays, we all have multiple accounts of social media. And do you think this kind of social media affects greatly on the individual need of themos? And if so, is it a positive one for politics, or do you think it's having more negative effect?
Well, I think overall social media has been very polarizing because what gets you attention on social media is not by saying things that are true or well thought out or reflect a consensus view about what reality is. You get attention by being outrageous, by attacking other people, by taking positions that are much more extreme than other people. And it rewards, those people that push the boundaries of, civilized discourse to new extremes. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we have the degree of polarization in politics today that is really unprecedented in many ways.
I liked your book themos because I thought it really greatly explains what is happening in this world right now. But at the same time, now we have identified perhaps the reason of current political situation. Do you think there is a political or practical way to solve this kind of situation using this concept?
Well, I don't think that there's an easy solution. In the United States, for example, there are many Americans that don't have a college education who feel that politicians and the media and elite people in universities look down on them, because they're not as educated. And I think that is really what's driving a lot of the resentment that then, has led them to vote for a politician like Donald Trump, who really understands them and reflects their understanding of the world. And so I think if there's a better understanding of why people feel disrespected, they would talk in ways that, appeal to those people and made them feel that they're actually part of a broader society, which right now they feel excluded from.
I think this resentment is showing in a lot of parts of the world, and one of them is in Europe. They have a right-wing populist parties, maybe earlier than the United States and even before Trump. Do you think there's a difference in the multi-party system and two-party system in reflecting those kind of recognition needs?
So I actually think that the electoral system really contributes to polarization. Both the United States and Korea have a single round plurality election for president. And that means that it's very difficult to vote for a president who is not one of the two major parties that are contesting. If you get slightly more of a plurality than the next highest person, then you are elected. And I think it means that it pushes people towards the extremes of politics because first you have to win your nomination within your party, and the people that vote in those kinds of elections or select the candidate tend to be more extreme than the general public. And so I do think that so and in any event, I don't think presidentialism is a good system. I think that it concentrates too much power, in one branch of government, and I think that it's been at the root of a lot of the problems we've experienced, both in in Korea and in the United States.
Do you think the party would be less radicalized if there are like multi-parties?
Yes.
As in Europe? Oh.
No, I mean, I think in the United States, if we had a multi-party system, both the Republicans and the Democrats would split into 2 or 3 parties, and you could have a coalition, for example, representing the moderate wing of the Democratic and the moderate wing of the Republican Party. But as it is, you have to take one or the other, and oftentimes they're split between, fairly extreme candidates.
So you advocate for proportional representation, perhaps?
Well, I think in a legislative election, yes, proportional representation. There's also the system that Australia uses, preference voting. I think that in a presidential election, you can solve the multi-party problem by moving to a 2-round election. So, for example, in the most recent Korean election, people would have been free to vote for the 3rd, 4th candidates, but then the 2 top vote getters would then have to go through a 2nd round. That's the system they have in France and Argentina and many other democracies. And that, at least if you're going to have a presidential system, that provides a little bit more alternative ways for voters to express their preferences.
We have a lot of talks about political reforms also in Korea and questions about presidentialism. That's a great help to hear.
I think another issue in Korea also is the synchronization of elections, because you've got a 5-year presidential term and then a 4-year term for members of the parliament, and that means that you're not electing at the same time, which means that a new president doesn't necessarily have a majority in the parliament, and that's also a problem.
So in your latest book, you criticize both the left and right versions of liberalism. What's the main shortcoming of both sides? Could you explain it a little bit?
Well, on the right, beginning in the 1980s and 90s, you had the rise of what's called neoliberalism that was represented by politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, where you have to have a market economy, but they took the market economy to an extreme where they cut back the state, they tried to cut back regulation, they tried to cut back redistribution, and that led to a growth in inequality, which I think is one of the sources of contemporary populism. On the left, you had a shift from a kind of classical progressive movement that was defined by social class to what's called identity politics, where your racial, ethnic, gender, other forms of identity became the most important thing about you, and not necessarily your income or your social class. And that, I think, has led to a backlash, because it's not a liberal way of understanding people. In a liberal society, you assume that as a human being, you are basically the equal of every other human being. In identity politics, you're making distinctions between different groups. Now, Korea doesn't have the extreme form of identity politics that the U.S. does, because it's very ethnically homogeneous. But for example, racial politics in the United States has been very contentious, because people on the left wanted to give advantages to African Americans, and people on the right were very resentful of the fact that they got these advantages, and felt that white people were being discriminated against. And so it's led to a very, I think, unpleasant form of polarized politics.
So you think in identity politics, racial is one of the most powerful factors, other than there's a gender and...
No, it can be over anything. Gender is also been, I think, very controversial. In many developed societies, women are actually doing much better than men in educational systems, and they're getting jobs. They're better qualified for many jobs. And I think that, there had been a long period where feminism wanted to give preference to women. So here, I think Korea is a little different from the United States, because I think the status of women has not been as high in Korea as in the United States. But in the US, there's this feeling that a lot of elite organizations are giving preference to women simply because they're women. And this has led to a big backlash on the part of conservatives who feel that that's not fair. Also, I think young men are particularly angry because in the job market competition, they're losing a lot of their jobs to women, and it really undermines their understanding of the traditional role of men in families and so forth.
I think, as you mentioned, Korea is a fairly homogeneous country, and I think this gender polarization is really deepening, especially in 20s. And the recent poll in our presidential election shows that the 20s men and women have the most different kinds of votes. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting for...
Yeah, I mean, that's becoming a universal phenomenon, that men and women at younger ages are very polarized politically.
And also, there has been a lot of calls for alternatives for liberalism for a lot of decades. But I think most of them had actually faded away. Although we're saying that democracy is in recession, we have been saying that for a long time as well. It means that democracy is still living. Do you think that this MAGA movement or right populist movement will also fade away?
Well, I hope so. I think that the problem is that there's really not a good alternative system of government other than liberal democracy. So for example, you could deny the premise that all people are equal, that certain people should have stronger rights than other people. But what group is that going to be? I don't think anybody really is going to advocate for that kind of thing publicly. One thing that I think is a problem in many democracies is that liberals or people on the left have tended to use too much law. So it becomes very difficult to make basic decisions. When you're trying to build infrastructure, there's a lot of conditions that you have to fulfill before you can go ahead. And that creates a kind of frustration that I think has led to the opposite extreme, where people like Donald Trump or Elon Musk say, okay, let's just ignore the laws altogether and just do what we want. And I think that's also a big threat to the liberal part of liberal democracy.
I like the word liberal part of liberal democracy. So related to the liberal part of liberal democracy actually combines the liberalism and democracy. And nowadays, for instance, a people leader like Viktor Orban says they have a liberal democracy. And China says that they can promote alternative sense of political system by they have authoritarian regime, but they can also have economic success, and that could be count as a new regime, as an alternative. Why do you believe that democracy must be grounded with liberalism?
Well, so just to define these terms, democracy means things like elections and popular choice. Liberalism has to do with a rule of law that limits the power of the executive, the president or the prime minister, and forces the government to act within legal constraints. And I think that the big attack in recent years has not been on the democratic principle, but on the liberal principle. So Viktor Orban, Narendra Modi, Donald Trump, the first thing they go after is the courts. They don't want to be constrained by the justice system, by the law. They want to be able to do whatever they want without somebody telling them that that's illegal or that's unconstitutional. And I think that that's really the crisis we're in. It's more a crisis of the liberal part of liberal democracy. Yeah, as you mentioned, Viktor Orban said that he doesn't want a liberal democracy, he wants an illiberal democracy.
I think mostly in Korea, people use the word democracy more than liberal democracy because we think that it is naturally coming from the word democracy. And I think that actually makes people less sensitive when the democracy starts to eroding in some liberal sense. Also, we mentioned a lot, but a lot of polarization is happening, not only in economic sense, but also in politics. And I think that comes mostly from economic recession as well, and this economic inequality calls for polarization as well. Have you ever found any example that this kind of polarization has been lessened, or can we see hope in somewhere in the area?
Well, you have a number of cases of depolarization. Unfortunately, they're usually connected to big national emergencies or traumas like wars or revolutions or things like that. You know, I mean, the United States was polarized before the Civil War, then they fought a civil war, and there's a new agreement, you know, that slavery was no longer acceptable. That's not the kind of depolarization you necessarily want to go through, but it usually does take some outside, you know, stimulus in order to get people to, you know, be more moderate in their, you know, in their political aspirations.
Current Western leaders seems to be less committed to protecting democracy as they did before. And do you see this as a serious issue, or do you think that Western or America or any other European countries should have more leadership in this kind of promoting democracy in the world?
Well, all countries need good leadership. And I think it's true that if you're going to promote democracy, you know, leaders need to talk about it and defend it. The problem is that, you know, to many, especially less educated voters, they don't care that much about democracy per se. They're much more interested in having a job, in the economy, and, you know, economic stability, you know, these kinds of issues. So, for example, in the United States, you know, in my view, Donald Trump was directly attacking American democracy when he urged this crowd to storm the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. And the Democrats tried to make that a big issue, but voters were actually much more concerned about inflation, which they blamed on President Biden. And that's really why Biden lost the election, despite the fact that Donald Trump had tried to overturn a legitimate election. And so I think that that indicates that for a lot of voters, you know, democracy is actually not as important as, you know, day-to-day concerns like the price of, you know, rice or bread or whatever.
Do you also consider if the journalism has actually failed to inform or maybe failed to represent these kind of problems as well?
I'm not sure it's a failure of journalism. You know, there's been this revolution, technological revolution, where the internet has displaced legacy, you know, TV, radio. I mean, we're doing this for YouTube, right? We're not doing this for a major, you know, a Korean television network. And I think that especially for younger people, that's the primary way that they consume news. And the thing about the internet is that anyone can say anything. You know, you don't have the same kinds of norms that tried to bolster the credibility of a traditional newspaper or TV, you know, network. And as a result, anyone can say anything, including many things that aren't true. And I think that's, you know, unfortunately the change that technology has brought about.
And I was actually curious because in Korea, when you search for a political news, right-wing news comes up first. They have a lot of viewership. And I think it's also similar in the US as well, and also in other countries. Do you think that there's a particular reasons why maybe it's the Trump of the right wing, or maybe it's a failure of the left wing?
Well, it's probably the case that people on the right were unhappy with the existing media system. And so they turned to things like YouTube and Facebook and online, you know, communications sooner than people on the left. That may be part of the explanation, but I honestly, it's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that.
Yeah, because I was really surprised because you sometimes see some kind of political news that pretends it's not really political, but as a meme or a very mean jokes. And there's, for me, it is a very political one, but they appear a lot in TikToks or Instagram feeds. So I was a bit surprised. And also when I search for them, most of them are very right-winged and they look really fancy. And I think For instance, even if it's legacy media, Fox Media is doing really well on these kind of things, but I think left media is a little bit behind of these kind of more trendy, fancy version of that. Yeah. Back to what is happening in the world outside. So Korea came from the martial law to the new president this year. How do you assess the situation from the martial law, from the outsider's view?
Well, yeah, I think everybody was surprised by President Yoon declaring martial law. I think that most observers outside of Korea thought that Korean democracy had consolidated in a way that no Korean politician would be willing to take that kind of a measure. So, you know, I was surprised when that happened. I think it speaks to the quality of democratic institutions that, you know, that didn't go ahead. Enough people resisted it so that you were able to actually have a new election and follow the proper constitutional procedures. But it was, you know, quite disturbing that somebody thought that it was necessary to take that kind of a measure.
And how about the impeachment? We gone through the second impeachment recently. And would you like to see an impeachment of president, or do you think that Korea has a little bit of particular president system?
You know, this gets back to why I don't like presidential systems, because it's very hard to get rid of a president. You know, an impeachment traditionally has been reserved for very extreme kinds of situations. So if you have evidence of very deep corruption or treason or something like that, you can impeach a president. But increasingly, impeachment has been used to simply signal a policy disagreement, that you don't like things that the president is doing legislatively, and so you try to impeach them. And I think the presidential system kind of forces that, because, you know, in a parliamentary system, if the prime minister is doing poorly, is not popular, you know, the party can simply replace that person with somebody else, the way they replaced, you know, Liz Truss with Rishi Sunak, you know, in Great Britain. But you can't do that in a presidential system. And so you have to resort to this really extreme measure of impeachment in order to get rid of a sitting president. So I just think that that's a feature that's built into, you know, presidential systems. Korea has used it more than other countries, and I think that's probably not a good sign.
We also have a different impeachment system. So we impeach a president, and legislative branch decides if it's a just one or not. For the United States, even if you, as some people want, even if you impeach the president, the vice president will just continue on his work. And if he's also impeached, then the other people will just come in the cabinet. And do you think that U.S. perhaps wants to change this kind of political system? Or does America has any view on their political reforms?
Well, there are many aspects of the U.S. Constitution that I think most political scientists would want to change. The most important really is the whole electoral college, because that allows a minority president, or a president that gets a minority of the popular vote, to still be president. That's happened to Trump in 2016. Hillary Clinton actually got more votes than he did, but because of the electoral college, he became the president. So that would be one issue. I think in general there's been a bias towards conservative candidates because of the Senate. The Senate, there are 2 senators per state, and a lot of the states are small Republican-leaning ones. So if you had a more democratic upper chamber, you probably would have fewer Republican-dominated, you know, senates. So there's various things I think that, you know, I would do if I were rewriting the Constitution. The problem is that it is so difficult to change the American Constitution that most of those changes are off the table. Another big one is campaign finance, because you know, many years ago the Supreme Court decided that spending money in politics was a form of free speech and could not be limited. And I think this has allowed someone like Elon Musk to donate $250 million, you know, to help Trump win the last election, and I think that that's not right.
On the other hand, I think in the last election campaign, Kamala Harris actually tried those grassroots movements to get fundings from normal citizens. And do you think that this kind of campaigns should be more promoted?
To be fair, these very rich people have not been able to sway a lot of elections. And in fact, sometimes if they donate too much money, people get resentful and they mobilize on the other side. So this happened in a judicial campaign in Wisconsin where Elon Musk wanted the Republican candidate to win. He gave a lot of money, and the Democratic one won because of resentment against, this rich outsider intervening. And so I do think that grassroots fundraising is important, and I don't think the system is completely corrupted by money, but it's getting that way.
It's really worse, and at least like for Korea, they have quite strict law on the financing of election, I think. So maybe that is one of the buffer for us.
Yeah, I think we should hold on to those.
Yeah, and also for Korea, as the martial law from the impeachment to the new presidential elections, we've got a lot of mobilization, a lot of protests, a lot of people going on the streets, and we sometimes call that a revolution on light because no one actually used violence, but they just went out with the light sticks. And nowadays, U.S. is having a massive protest. I'm not sure if you call them massive because I'm not sure compared to our population size. But what do you see of No Kings movement?
Well, it's hopeful. I think that people are really unhappy with the current Trump administration. And I think that it's important for them to express that frustration. And holding these mass protests is one way of doing it.
Do you think the movement will spread to other cities as well?
I hope so. I don't know whether people, it depends on things that Trump does, that stimulate this kind of reaction.
But I think the question is, would Trump, which city protest would Trump care the most?
Well, actually, it wasn't a particular protest. It was his own military parade that was being held the same day. He hoped that it was also on his birthday, so it was really like a North Korean kind of, celebration of the, dear leader, and it was a failure. I mean, nobody showed up for that, and I think that sent a powerful message that he actually is not as popular as he would like to be or thinks he is.
There's a lot of different ways of having protest or showing discomfort in Trump's or any of leaders' political behaviors. Do you think that inactiveness of military sides, for instance, in Korea, when President Yoon had enacted martial law, some of the military leaders were very, very passive in doing that, and sometimes even not directly rejected it, but they were really not that cooperative. Do you think that kind of mechanisms would still work in the US as well?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the problem is that, Trump wanted to use the military to, for example, arrest protesters in his first term, and the senior leadership of the military didn't go along with that.
Yeah.
But he's been busy replacing a lot of senior officers with people who are more politically aligned with him. And so, he understands that that's a problem, that he's not going to get support from the senior military, and he's trying to fix that by replacing them.
I really hope that there's a way for democracy and capitalism to go along. Do you think that it is complacent form of governments?
Well, I think they're actually necessary to keep each other going. It's just that if you let capitalism run unregulated, it's going to lead to increasing inequality. And that's why you actually need democracy in order to, protect people against, some of the displacements and, job losses and so forth that a capitalist economic system produces.
So that is sort of checks and balances between two systems, one political system and one economic system. Yeah. And you wrote your book, Identity, after Trump was elected. Now that Trump is elected again, do you plan for another book, or is there any topic you're interested in delving into?
Well, actually, my next book is mostly written, it's actually more of an autobiography where I've written about, my own life and,
We should have interviewed after the autobiography came out.
I'll come back to Korea for that.
Yeah. Oh, it's great to know. It's almost done. When do you
Well,
expect
it's
it to
mostly
finish?
completed, but it probably won't be published till next year.
Oh, and any other projects you're interested in at the moment?
Well, mostly it concerns domestic American politics because I think that Trump needs to be resisted, but there also needs to be a good Democratic Party alternative to him, and I don't see one right now. So,
Great to know. And finally, could you send a message to Korean students or anyone who advocates for democracy for the next generation people?
okay, sure. Well, I would like to congratulate Korea as a country for the survival of its democratic institutions in the face of the attempted coup by the last president. I think that the task now is to overcome the high degree of polarization that exists in Korean society. It's similar to what we're experiencing in the United States, and it's hard to have a healthy democracy when people are that polarized. And so I think that's really the challenge that young Koreans need to meet, as we go forward. But you should also be pleased that your democratic institutions survived and, will continue into the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And thank you once again for
Okay.
coming to Korea.
Sure.